Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're around the world. Welcome to our latest webcast, Streamlining Financial Risk Management and Control at Starbucks. Thank you very much for joining us for today's session. My name's Dan French. I'm founder and CEO at Consider Solutions. I know many of you, so welcome. I'm very pleased to be joined by Jennifer Getman, who's the Director of Global Financial Policies and Controls at Starbucks, who works for the corporate controller there. Welcome, Jennifer.
Good morning. Thank you.
Good morning. It is certainly morning in Seattle, 8 a.m.
Morning in Seattle, correct.
Yeah. And welcome to Martin Reeves, who's been working closely with Jennifer on this initiative. Welcome, Martin. So, just a little bit of perspective. Those of you who know Consider Solutions, you know our view of the world, but just for those of you who don't, just to understand how we're coming at this, we tend to take the view and work with organizations who aspire to this world-class capability, helping to drive better business results, reduce the cost of finance, optimize cash flow, and have better risk management. And we deliver that through the pillars on the right-hand side. And certainly today is very much about financial control and compliance and risk management, but there's also a big element of process transformation in there as well. So we're also very lucky to be influenced by some major organizations around the world who we're proud to work with. This is a selection of them. Many of you are on the call, so thank you for joining us. And these folks and others challenge us regularly to come up with new and better ways of dealing with processes around these topics, and also challenge us to run these kind of webcasts. So thank you all. So objectives today are pretty clear. We want to facilitate the sharing of the Starbucks story about creating this new, streamlined, more effective global financial risk and control process. So that's a primary objective, but also want to dig into some of the underlying issues, the challenges that inhibit effective work in this area. I think many of you, like us, have been exposed to this for many, many years and have seen some of these challenges. We want to dig into those. And we'll also talk a little bit about where received wisdom can get in a way, and hopefully provide some actionable strategies for your own journeys in your world. So I'm making these introductions. I'll follow with some thoughts about risk management and financial control, and the term the constant gardener will become apparent as I go through this. It's nothing to do with the movie, but I'll do that. And oh dear, somebody's pressing buttons. Hold on. So talk about, I'll hand over to Jennifer to talk about the Starbucks experience, and then let Martin come up with some of the detail about how we deliver those outcomes, or how Starbucks deliver those outcomes, and I'll come up with some thoughts for the road at the end. This whole webcast will take 45-50 minutes. We do encourage you to ask questions. There's a Q&A panel on your GoToWebinar panel there. Feel free as you go through, as something comes across that hits your mind, enter a question in there, and we will endeavor to answer it at the end as part of this session. If we don't have time to answer it here, we'll do it by email. If you have any technical issues, use the same panel and one of our team will get back to you and help you out. So we've got a few questions for you as well, only a small number, but just to keep you engaged and also to give some context to you all. So the first one, very simple. These are anonymous, but they help give context for, you can see who you're sharing this discussion with. What is the primary focus of your role? Is it number one, financial controls, internal controls, SOX, compliance, that general theme? Number two, broader finance role. Number three, IS, IT, applications. Number four, audit. And number five, other. So if you just want to have a go at that, you're 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. If you're not 1, 2, 3, or 4, you're certainly 5. Should be pretty straightforward. And let's just see what the blend of audience we have today is. So let's have a look at that. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's have a look at that. Oh, yeah. So most of you are in the financial controls, or the biggest percentage, 38% financial controls, followed by audit. Okay, that's good to know. Okay, thank you for that. So we're talking about risk management, control, and compliance, and it's very easy, certainly for folks in the business, to assume risk management is the thing that stops you getting business done. but and it's sort of a bad thing. The truth, we all know that driving business forward, making business processes deliver the goods, is a combination of both driving performance and managing risk. So it's taking opportunities and minimizing the threats. So I think this analogy of the sailboat, racing sailboat across the ocean in sort of challenging conditions is a pretty good analogy for today's life. And certainly there's no greater example of having to manage both threat and opportunity than we have today. So I think that's an important kind of context for us. But we're also in a world where businesses around the world are focusing on global processes, how to integrate the end-to-end value streams they have in their businesses. So whether it's on the revenue cycle, customer to cash, we see right from the front end through to the settlement end, lots of collaboration, stakeholders, and there's a complexity there. And then if you move on, on the expense side, source to pay, purchase to pay, it's the same thing. These are long, complex cycles. They look simple on these charts, but there's a lot of collaboration required to make these things work, a lot of integration. And the same is true on risk management. We call this risk to perform. So everything from identification and assessment of risks, through monitoring and mitigation, through assurance and managing the business through risk-informed decision-making. And again, there's a lot of stakeholders and participants. So the collaboration isn't as straightforward, and this is why a lot of organizations find it challenging. And when we talk about that collaboration challenge, it's easy to say, yes, end-to-end global processes, we've got it. I am fascinated for the past year and a half by this Dunning-Kruger curve. I'm sure many of you have also been mesmerized by it. It's about 20 years old. These two psychologists basically did a piece of work, some research that demonstrated that intelligent people, when faced with new situations, they quickly get some facts together and they form opinions, decisions, and judgments, which they have very high degrees of confidence in, despite having no real experience of operating in that sphere before. And some of you will laugh at this and think we've all worked in businesses like this, but it's quite a serious thing, and we all suffer from it. So as you delve into, get experience in the topic, you suddenly realize, actually, this is more complex and more nuanced than we thought. It's much harder. And if you get halfway through this, you get quite depressed in the middle of that curve. And if you get to the end of it, you develop the expertise, you get to a level of confidence, but the expert never has the level of confidence that the person with little knowledge has, which is kind of an interesting perspective. And certainly they say the expert is the first to say, I don't know. Now this affects everything, whether it's playing a guitar, doing long distance running, implementing process transformation, implementing a new system. All of these things are true. We all suffer from this kind of this effect, which obviously has some root in our evolution, and it does affect pretty much every process change or even technology change. And I think you'll see it affect here. And here's an example. So we're talking about internal controls. If you look at this image here, it's the entrance to a parking lot, and you'll see in the middle an electronic parking barrier. If you look very carefully. And when you drive in, you swipe your ID card, it recognizes you, opens the ID barrier, through you go. On the way out, you do the same thing, it lets you out. Now, to anybody thinking, and it's sort of Dunning-Kruger thinking, if you think about that as a piece of technology, you can prove that it's 99.999% recurring accurate. It works, it's provably correct, it works, it's a very effective control, a very effective piece of machinery. The same is true with our business controls, especially where they're related to systems and technology. We tend to assume we have a control, therefore it works. But when the snow falls, you start to see the fallacy in the argument. And this is really the kind of Dunning-Kruger thing. When you get into it, you realize, well, yeah, it does work efficiently and it works all the time, but doesn't necessarily manage the risk all the time. So I think this is a good example of Dunning-Kruger and the topic we're talking about today. So just something to give you a wry smile. Now, obviously, we're talking about internal controls of financial reporting, and this is a great little diagram from CISO, and I like the way it reflects kind of the high-level picture. The cascade of ICFR is about making sure we don't have, any meaningful misstatement in our financial accounts, and then we break down the accounts into what business processes feed those accounts, what applications support the business processes, what technologies support that. And then you've got the role of IT general controls and the application or process controls that support those. And so it's a very good kind of high level view of what, of how our controls operate and what they're there for. one of the interesting things about received wisdom is it's surprising how often you hear, even sometimes from the audit community, that segregation of duties, for example, referred to as an IT general control. And it absolutely isn't an IT general control, unless, of course, you're talking about the small number of circumstances where you're looking at IT-related activities who shouldn't be done in combination. But from a business point of view, it's absolutely a business control. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of organizations struggle with this kind of dichotomy. Where's it sit? I think we'll hear more about that later. And of course, we've got the 3 lines of defense, and it's a very good model. It's worked well in many cases, but it's slightly misunderstood as well, I think. So, you know, the first line of defense are those that execute policy and processes. They manage risk at the front end of the business while executing the business activities, whether in procurement or sales or marketing or HR, whatever. The second line of defense is where we put a lot of focus of the folks that define and manage and monitor the policies and processes of control and assurance. And the third line of defense is the independent assurance. But quite often we get very fixated about the second line and almost ignore the people who are actually doing the risk management, which is the first line of defense, the operational management, the first line managers. So kind of these received wisdom elements are important, but it's important to be clear we understand how they work. Now, of course, with regard to controls, and particularly in a Sarbanes-Oxley world, you know, we're very fixated on making sure we don't suffer any audit comments that might indicate a material weakness or any kind of significant deficiency. So there's kind of a aversion, a fear of being in that top right-hand corner, which is understandable. And but the challenge is that fear, it's kind of sort of counterintuitively tends to encourage us to operate in an unhealthy way. So, and this is my constant gardener slide, is we end up with a garden, a business where controls aren't working very well. We get an audit comment, so you've got deficiencies, maybe a material weakness. You've got to do something about it. The organization galvanizes because it's such a critical observation made. It gets public airing. So then everyone works together, cleans up the controls, and we've got a garden that looks pretty healthy. But before we know it, everyone's back to where they were before, and within a year, you're back to the same old story again. So this whole kind of lurching from reactivity to reactivity. And I think one of the lessons is we have to get out of that and just focus on running a healthy business so that this thing is not happening. So with that as an introduction and some of the kind of the issues we'll dig into, very pleased to welcome Jennifer Getman, Director, Global Financial Policies and Controls at Starbucks, who's going to talk to us about the Starbucks experience. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you, and welcome everyone, and good morning from Seattle. I know everyone has a different time zone, but just to give you a little bit of background, I'm the Director of the Global Financial Policies and Controls, and we have a team that goes by Global Financial Risk and Controls, GFRC, and to Dan's slide about the different lines of defense. So GFRC sits in the second line of defense and support the business from that perspective to get alignment. So we're prepared for the auditors and also the design of controls and the effectiveness of controls. So definitely a business support function. Okay, there we go. So everyone is familiar with Starbucks, so I won't spend too much time on this slide, but just gives you a magnitude of the magnitude of the size of Starbucks, as well as when you take on a project that I'm going to discuss, just how big the organization is and the different areas that are impacted, especially from a global perspective. When you're dealing with any application or any system, it touches so many different partners, so many different applications, as well as different locations, and the amount of collaboration across the organization gets more challenging due to the size and complexity. So I did want to touch briefly just on COVID because it's so relevant to businesses today. And one of the things that has been a challenge for Starbucks is just everything happened so suddenly, and we experienced COVID in China first, one of our largest markets. And so we really had to learn to monitor and adapt to the situation in China. And then as things improved in China and COVID really transitioned to the US, it definitely created a lot of issues when we had to go to a working from home model, we had to close stores, and how we navigated to continue our business in that type of environment. And one of the things on the financial side that really was a success story was we were able to do a quarter end close with everyone working from home, and we had never done that before, and navigating that type of challenge and still being able to do our jobs was definitely a success story, and what we learned along the way from China and be able to reflect that in the US market as well. And then also taking our store model and changing it. Once we had to close stores, we had to come up with a plan to reopen stores, and what would that look like? What's the store format? And we looked at the drive-through and mobile order and pay model to keep our customers and partners safe, but also provide the Starbucks experience. So it's been an ongoing challenge, and as in the US, we're starting to be able to open stores. We're moving away from not only providing drive-through and mobile order and pay, but we don't have our cafes open. So how do we continue to allow customers in the stores and still be safe? So really monitoring and adapt has become our mantra to be able to deal with COVID and also keep our partners and also our customers safe. So we're learning as we go, as I'm sure many businesses are, and you'll see changes, not only from an organizational perspective and a finance perspective, but also in our stores and what the store format evolves to. So what the project that I'm going to talk about is really, it was an opportunity for change. The project I'm talking about relates to Oracle SOD, but it really was more of an opportunity to create a roadmap and a framework for changing how we do things. And we were in a position where we were always cleaning up, and we were more on a detective control perspective versus a preventive control perspective. So we had new leadership, we had new ideas, and how do we make that mental shift from a detective to a preventive environment? We looked a lot at organizational risk, IT, and business risk. And I think when Dan mentioned that something like SOD is not an IT focused issue, it's a business issue, I was probably the first to come to that realization and realize that it's actually my responsibility from a business perspective, and it was easier to say it was an IT issue. And then when you're not sure who owns it, no one owns it. So it was really a key realization for GFRC as a team to realize that we're going to need to own this and make the change. A lot of awareness that came into compensating and mitigating controls. We really wanted to get away from compensating controls. And that was a different mindset, because when we had this project, we really had to focus on how we're going to fix the problem versus letting the problem exist and pointing to compensating controls. And it was going to be a challenge, but it really was a mindset shift to be able to realize we're going to have to just dig in and fix the problem. And even though we may not have a finding because we have compensating controls, have we really mitigated the risk? So what I walked into, so I've been in role for a little over a year, and what I realized is that we had SOD conflicts with Oracle. We have them across multiple applications, but the finance application was, from our perspective, the largest risk. So we really had to look at what we were dealing with, and the number and the magnitude of the risk from both the responsibilities as well as the user conflicts was daunting when we actually looked at the numbers. But it was really trying to figure out, what are we dealing with? What all is out there? Are these true risks? Are the compensating controls mitigating the risk. And without understanding and digging in, we really couldn't answer that question. And I mentioned before that we had international SOD conflicts, we had international partners and international responsibilities that not only existed internationally, where there were certain responsibilities that were relevant to a China market, may not be relevant to a US market, and it was a global problem. And we really need to refine not only the compensating controls, but really identify whether or not compensating controls was the right answer. The biggest challenge, I would say, is identifying the right resources. So once it's identified that this is a business risk and we are going to own it from a GFRC perspective, figuring out then who we need to partner with, because we don't have the IT expertise that we need, but who in IT do we deal with, and how do we get the answers, and how do we educate ourselves, and how do we educate the right IT folks so that they understand the business risks. So identifying the right people and the right teams to involve was one of the biggest challenges. And you will hear me say throughout this presentation the difference between a get clean process, which was really the dig in and we need to fix these not only responsibility conflicts, but user conflicts, and then transition to a stay clean process, which is the provisioning process and the change management process. So the get clean and the stay clean was really how we identified the different steps in the process. So this is a lot of information, but the point of this slide is to really show you the complexity of what we're dealing with. There were many end-to-end processes in many different applications. Even though we were dealing in this instance with Oracle, you'll see many different business processes that actually impacted Oracle, and then looking at the segregation of duty risk as well as access risk. So it was a global problem, but so many moving parts and so much detail. So we really had to take this overall approach and determine how we're going to remediate the issue. And I mentioned that we had the get clean process, which really talked about digging in and understanding what the responsibilities and the roles conflicts and what those were made up of. And then we had responsibilities that actually had conflicts within the responsibilities that were not, when they were developed, had inherent conflicts in the actual responsibility. So that didn't even have to do with the users. It had to do with how we had designed the Oracle responsibilities. And then we had to look at what we're going to do to transition to the stay clean process. So our provisioning process and how we're going to get change management. So all of these areas were involved in not only the stay clean process, the provisioning process on the end, but we had to get them involved on the front end to actually get clean. So this is an overview of the teams involved, and this is at a really high level because when you look at all of these roles and responsibilities, there were many teams and many partners within these organizations that rolled up to this project. So although you'll see we have an overall owner and a steering committee, and these are pretty high level and operational leadership, there were so many operational teams that lead up to this actual project team. And when I look at the technology team and the business team, there's so many operations within each of those teams that really led to the success of this project. So this is really kind of an idea of how complex and how much collaboration was necessary to get this project done. So we had the project team. Martin, who you'll hear from Consider, was really part of the project team. And so it was our job to identify who needs to be involved in the project, but then to get the consulting that we needed to make the changes that were necessary. And I don't want to forget about my technology partners, because they were phenomenal in this process. Because from a business perspective, not being a technology expert, not having the IT background, the amount of education that our technology team provided, not only to the GFRC team, but to the business, was the true success of this project. Realization 1, ownership and accountability. So really, I would say that each team, whether it's internal audit, finance, and technology, everyone had a different perspective, but the same issue. And everyone was operating in silos. So everyone knew what they were responsible for, but didn't necessarily understand how what they were doing impacted the other team. So we really had to break down the barriers, and everyone had to work together and no longer focus on what you were responsible for, but look at it as an end-to-end process and make sure that you understand when you did something, how it was going to impact another team. And we had to have the tone at the top. We had to have leadership involved, that these are the resources needed. This is the time and effort it's going to take to be able to get the alignment we needed, and everyone make it a priority. And I mentioned already the end-to-end process in sufficient detail, and the amount of, for me and our team at GFRC, to understand the IT impacts and what do these responsibilities mean? What creates a conflict? How do we actually remediate this problem, but also understand what our business needs are? One of the things that was key was this process journey thinking. And what we did is we identified each journey throughout this process, and then that's how we started to tackle what journey and what stage of this project we were in, to be able to provide the clarity and efficiency that we needed as we worked through each journey. And then also the steering committee was key to be able to show the momentum and the visibility, and also the progress. And I would say that was probably one of the key success points throughout this project, is when we started and we had so many conflicts, both from responsibility conflicts as well as user conflicts, to be able to run the reports each week or every few days and see the amount of progress that we've made in eliminating the conflicts was just really exciting, and everyone shared in the success of the project. So as daunting as it was, we could see immediate progress, and that's really what fed our momentum to keep the project moving. Collaboration, realization number 2, collaboration. I can't emphasize this enough, because you have to be comfortable asking for help, and it's okay to admit you don't know something. And with the Oracle experience, it was very difficult at times to know what responsibilities and how they were defined, and understanding also what the business was using that responsibility for. So there was a lot of education, and you have to go into it knowing that it's okay to ask questions and need help, because I couldn't fix something I didn't understand. And so collaborating with the business as well as the IT really provided that clarity that I needed to understand how I was going to help the business and lead this project. I mentioned the journeys. We really worked on a common understanding of what stage of each of these journeys we were in, and what needed to be accomplished during each of those journeys. And the common vocabulary, at least in the Oracle world, was really important to be able to understand what these responsibilities mean and educate the business on what they're approving when they provide access. I mentioned the tone at the top. When it's a priority to leadership, that is key, because we were reporting out to leadership our progress, and that was probably not only the momentum, but also the accountability. And we definitely needed that accountability if we were going to make the change. And everyone has a role: IT, finance, audit, business. And I would say one of the other key areas of this is that bring everyone on the journey with you. Let internal audit know what you're working on. Show them the project. It's just showing them not only where you started, but what your goals are and the progress that you make along the way. Because as daunting as it was, being able to show the progress really showed how we mitigated the risk along the way and how we were going to get there. And change management and communication are key. It is so easy to fall back into old patterns and also get pushback that that's not how we've done it in the past. And showing and demonstrating the change management and how this is going to make everyone's lives easier and getting buy-in for that change was really key to that collaboration, how we can work together and why this being successful would be a benefit to everyone involved. Complexity. I showed the chart of all the different processes and applications involved, but this, just the number, the sheer magnitude of roles and responsibilities was pretty overwhelming. When you have an Excel spreadsheet with so many results and so many responsibilities and not understanding what the data means, you really had to dissect it into little small pieces to get that success. And it really took time to understand, what does the data mean? And if you just looked at it at a high level, you weren't going to be able to drill down and fix it. So it was complex, but really just looking at user access, not only from the business side and understanding what the business needed, but also the complexity of how Oracle was designed. And coming from someone who is not an IT person and looking at how Oracle was designed was challenging, but that's where I just had to be educated from our IT counterparts. So this gives you a little bit of the many moving parts: roles, responsibilities, application, business risk. When do you need compensating controls? And although our goal was not to have compensating controls, there was a business need to have some responsibilities and SOD conflicts that had to point to compensating controls. But it wasn't just a rubber stamp. We had to understand from the business perspective why the role was required and why we were going to have an SOD conflict, and then be able to explain it and how we had a compensating control. But those were few and far between, and definitely something that wasn't just accepted, it had to be verified. Movers, leavers, and joiners, part of the provisioning process, always a challenge. How do we manage movers, leavers, and joiners when access was sometimes just carried forward to your next role? Or how did we manage that provisioning process when someone wasn't a new user, they were just changing access? But as we did that, that could create SOD conflicts, and how are we going to manage that? So each of these components was part of different journeys throughout the process. So we really had to break it down into smaller parts so that it wasn't overwhelming, as well as reduce the complexity. And I think my overall realization there that is, as complex as it gets, it's okay not to know everything, but ask for help. So after 8 months of an intense project with great success, we now have a collaborative approach, an enhanced understanding of process, risk, IT, and applications. And I would say, as much as I relied on the IT team learned about the business process. So it wasn't a one-way street. It definitely was a two-way street, and they understand now what the business needs are and why it's important for them to understand why access is needed, and to be very aware of the need for that provisioning process and change management. We have a common vocabulary and agreed roles and responsibilities. We are now in the stay clean process, and no one wants to go back to the get clean process. So we all have a vested interest for that stay clean process to be successful, as well as make sure that our provisioning and change management those rules are followed. And we've shifted from a preventative control to a preventative control and no longer a detective control. Lesson learned, I talked a little bit about this already, but not going back to our old ways. Collaboration, we're actually going to take this collaboration and this team approach and use it on multiple applications. Now that we have a workflow, we have teams involved, we can take what we've learned in this Oracle SOD project and not only apply it to other applications, but apply it to different processes across the organization, because it's a model that works for any type of project and that team approach. We also are moving away from a manual, and we're being able to automate this process and all of the SOD checks, as well as some of the provisioning, being able to have a workflow so that it's now automated. So everyone's seeing the benefit of this project in that the amount of hours that they spend dealing with, whether it's an SOD or provisioning issue, it's being reduced, and it's much more efficient now than it ever was in the past. The future, stay clean. That is the goal. And I think now that we've changed behaviors and we have a provisioning process in place, we've also been able to document a global policy to be adhered to. So it's definitely a change in mindset, but also everyone understands now that this is the message and everyone's adhering to the new policy. Global process ownership, you have to have accountability. And we've gone to a point now where we have identified global process owners, global functional owners, and there is accountability across the organization. And that collaboration is sustainable. It's actually built strong relationships and everyone works together, and it's a cross-functional project, but it's now not only a project, it's cross-functional process on so many different levels. We have clear roles and responsibilities throughout the organization, moving from manual to automated, and that's an ongoing effort. It doesn't happen overnight, but we see the benefit in such a initially, like immediately you see the benefit in moving to automated processes. And now we're going to, as I mentioned, take this model and put it into different applications as well as different projects and processes across Starbucks. If I had to offer advice, these are my top 5. And don't let the initial shock overwhelm you, because I think the knee jerk is to, well, we have compensating controls, it's worked in the past, we've mitigated the risk. But the problem still existed. And I think that it can be overwhelming, and it's easier to say, well, it's an IT problem, or, well, that was easier for me, but it's a business problem or an IT problem. But really, it's an organizational problem that everyone has a part in and a stake in making it right. And take it into different pieces and look at those journeys and celebrate your successes. We achieved so much in such a short time that it really gave us the momentum to keep making those changes. Don't be afraid to ask for help. I'm not an IT person, and I just needed help understanding what everything means, and then also take the time to educate people on what you know. Don't assume they know what you do, and take that time to educate them, because that's all part of that collaboration. And it's a process, not a project. So it started as a project, it evolved to a process, and now it's going to continue to be a process. And the three realizations, ownership and accountability, collaboration and complexity, those are the 3 realizations, but they're also the 3 key areas to make not only the project successful, but to change that project into a process.
Thank you, Jennifer. You've had a busy 8 months. So
yes, I have.
So thank you. So quick couple of questions before we get into the how those were delivered, those outcomes, just for you. So in your own organization, who is the overall owner of the SOD risk management process in your organization? I don't mean the individual SOD risks, I mean the SOD risk management process. Is it 1, the controller, 2, the head of financial control, internal control or SOX, 3, the CIO, 4, the head of audit, or 5, somebody else, or I don't know, because we're limited to 5 answers with GoToWebinar, so have to be creative. So have a think about that. It's anonymous. It's just to get a sense of the audience. So who's the overall owner of SOD risk management process in your organization? Let's have a look. Give you 5 seconds. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. It's useful to you all to get the context of this discussion. So let's see what we get. So, okay, so the controller and the head of financial control are kind of pretty equal there at about 29–30%, and quite a reasonable number other or don't know. A few in the IT organization, 5% the CIO, and 10% with the head of audit. Okay, thank you. And one other question. How would you describe your current status of user access controls in SOD? Is it 1, ineffective? We've got all sorts of audit management discussions going on. 2, it's kind of challenging. 3, it's good, but got some potential for improvement. 4, it's highly effective. Or 5, not sure, don't know. So again, it's anonymous. It's just good to see the state of the aggregate state across the world, because there's a lot of you on this webcast. So 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Let's so ineffective, challenging, good. 4, highly effective. 5, not sure, don't know. Let's have a look at the answers there. So, all right. So good. So the highest proportion is good with some potential for improvement. Okay, and I guess that could have been predicted, I guess. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. Now, I want to introduce you to Martin Reeves, who's going to talk about how Starbucks delivered the outcomes that Jennifer talked about. So Martin and Jennifer work closely in this. So over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everybody. So what I'd like to do in this 15 minutes is to look at, just remind ourselves about financial controls and the assurance they give us. Then look at the principles of get clean and stay clean, using customer journey mapping as a basis for the stay clean approach, and then success factors for sustaining the process. So Dan mentioned Dunning-Kruger and the fact that with little experience, we place a lot of confidence in something new, like, for example, global end-to-end processes. And this can lead us to believe that big changes can be implemented easily, but in reality, they're often harder to achieve than we at first thought. So on financial controls, I think we all know about segregation of duties and sensitive access. The idea that it's never good for one person to have access for a full end-to-end process. It can cause conflicts of interest, fraud, and error. So we need to put segregation of duties in place, and just as importantly, we need to monitor on the effectiveness of the segregation of duties that we put in place. We also have the challenge of, in this dynamic world of joiners, movers and leavers, of ensuring that the access that our people have is appropriate to their jobs, that it's timely, that it reflects the organization. For deprovisioning for people leaving, for example, it's vital that there's timeliness on deprovisioning, and we have to ensure that we have processes for job rotations, delegation of authority, and we also need a clear approval process. We also have configured controls, embedded controls that ensure that our approvals, tolerances, limits, dependencies for three-way match, for example, are in place and turned on. I think important bit there, again, monitoring that they are turned on, that they're working as designed, and that they are switched on. And transaction level monitoring, the idea that we can monitor to detect anomalies in master data. So if someone's made changes to bank details on vendors, we probably want to know about it. We can detect duplicate vendor records. And then we can look from a transactional perspective, we can look at who's doing what within our systems and detect any patterns of unusual behavior. So that's the controls. If we think about the processes, so I think get clean, it's a doable job. I mean, Jennifer referred to it as a dig in and fix, and it's a project, and it's got outcomes and objectives that are clearly defined, and it's easy to get through it. But I think the challenge comes when we get to stay clean, because there's a lot of complexity with it. So in stay clean, in get clean, I think the important bit here was that the principles that we used were, so from a role and responsibility remediation perspective, that we didn't have any inherent SOD conflicts, that we'd no compensating controls on roles and responsibilities, but they were on the users themselves. And of course, we tried to minimize false positives. And from a residual user remediation perspective, it was by units of management, which means by business area or by department or by region. We had automated one-pager reporting that were easy to understand, easy to use, and facilitated ease of response. And of course, we kept compensating controls as a genuine last resort. But on Stay Clean, it's very clear to us that it's not just about provisioning. I mean, it is user access provisioning as the core, but there's also lots of other components that can affect the actual risk profile of our SODs. So for example, if there's changes to applications, we're putting in some new functionality, new customizations, then that will propagate new responsibilities and roles, means changing the configuration of our monitoring technology. We have compensating controls. They need to be effective. If they're not effective, then they're not addressing the SOD risk. And I think compensating control is, it's an Achilles heel really for me. How do we know compensating controls are being performed in the business? I mean, it's not enough just to report on them. It's more important to capture the decision that's being made upon them. Then we have things like privileged users. So giving people temporary elevated access means that they're sort of, from an SOD perspective, they're licensed to kill for a short period of time, and we've got to make sure that we could control that privileged access. So we know it's all about process, and we know that it's complex, and there's many moving parts. And the chart like you see here, so these are very good for executive summaries, but we need a mechanism to analyze and understand the separate components independent of each other. So we decided that the mechanism to do this would be to use journeys and customer journey mapping. So we use this as an approach for the Stay Clean components and sub-processes. So here we can see those components of the Stay Clean journey. We can see business as usual that focuses around the user access provisioning, but we've got pieces in there like I've mentioned compensating controls, but the risk and compliance technology. We have lots of tools in this portfolio: GRC tools, IDM tools, provisioning, monitoring, and we need to understand who is going to use them, what's the segregation of duties in using those tools, for example. We also have the roles and responsibilities and application changes, which can cause changes to configurations in the technologies as an example. So let's have a look at one of these journeys. So we've got at the top, we've got the journey itself. This one is an as-is for role responsibility change. And we've got the process. We can see activities. We can map out what the goals, KPIs are, or the policies and controls. What are the touch points between various organizations? Who's responsible? Who's accountable? What's the documentation that we have, standards and guidelines? What's the technology? But more importantly is what we can map here is the user experience story. So the idea of capturing behavior, concerns, motivations across touch points on that journey. And in doing that, then we can identify weaknesses, pain points, challenges, what works well, and then we can start to assess that as a marker for improvement. They're easy to use, they're easy to develop, and it gives us that common vocabulary and common understanding. And during this project, I can say a lot of these maps they became certainly my office decoration on the walls, and I think the hotels as well. They were often pasted to the walls to get the full picture of what we were doing. Here we see a to-be map. So based on the analysis that we've done around the as-is process, we can now focus on what do we need to improve and put together. And here you can see in yellows the pieces that are relevant to risk management and SOX compliance, so the policies and control pieces that we need to put in place to improve these journeys from a risk compliance perspective. And the journeys, they actually become the essence of communication. Dan mentioned at the beginning the three lines of defense, and the fact that these journeys become the baseline of communication, change management for the first line. Because if we want this to be successful, it lives and dies with operations and the business. They want to know, what is it we're trying to achieve? What's the expectation on me? What are the rules of play? What do I need to do and when? And what's the escalation plan? So we can use this as a basis for from the journeys and use it to as part of our communication and change management. As we move from project to process, we need to ensure that on the left-hand side, you can see a project organization that's in place. We need to ensure that organization, with a multidisciplinary team, with a governance structure, with subject matter experts in the business, that we transition that as we move from project to process, and you can see that on the right-hand side. We also need a global process owner who ensures that the process is being executed as it should be, that it's being continuously improved, and that we have the ongoing change management and communication. And I think a roadmap of objectives, milestones, deliverables, it's important to set expectations. It reminds us of what the long-term strategies and goals are. And I think it also helps us set the drumbeat of communication as well. So finally, a few takeaways. So we've mentioned the journeys. I think if I had to pick out three things here, so understanding the risk versus business practice mitigation. Very often we assume that the mitigation that's being done in the business, that works, that's all well and good. But often we should get into this discipline of understanding what the risk is, and then what can we do to assure ourselves that it is working as it should be. If you remember Dan's car park slide at the beginning, we need to monitor maybe that the business practice mitigation is actually working as it should. We should avoid tool preoccupation, and the next big thing. The success here is definitely around process, and sometimes we can get certainly, and I'm one of them. I come from technology, and you can get excited about the new toys that are out there, but I think the focus has got to be around process and the technology that we have in place. Does that fit the bill? And I think the most important thing, from a monitoring perspective, as we move from get clean and reporting on a quarterly basis, is to transition to this sustainable continuous monitoring. So the idea that we understand the landscape and risk profile on a daily basis rather than on a 3-month basis. So Dan, back to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin. There's some great insights there. I'm going to move pretty fast because we are running over time. Any questions that you haven't yet asked, please put them into the system, and we can, even if we don't get time to do them today, we will get to you and get back to you on them. Great insights there. I mean, if you listen to Jennifer, it looked like Mission Impossible 8 months ago. They've scaled some very impressive peaks, and Martin's described that kind of roadmap view. And I think they've done an amazing job in a global, large-scale organization in very short order. That's great. Final question for you. You've heard about Stay Clean, you've heard about some of the challenges. How would you rate the effectiveness of your SOD Stay Clean approach in your business? Is it 1, non-existent, ineffective, which is quite a common situation? Is it a technical approach, but there's not really much process and governance? Is it a kind of balanced technical process, governance definition? Is it a highly effective process, governance, and technical approach, or is it I'm not sure, I don't know. So 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Again, it's anonymous, just interesting to share the view with everybody. I'm conscious of time, so I'll give you 5 seconds. So non-existent is 1, extremely outstandingly good is 4, and you can work out 2 and 3 and 5. So let's have a look at your results, please. So we have a lot of people with a good solid approach, which is defined. Only 7% of you feel you have a highly effective process. I hope that's not just the Starbucks folks on the webcast. and a percentage of you don't know, but it's worth finding out. Anyway, thank you. So one thing I've observed about this is getting this stuff done, getting these processes implemented, and Martin kind of touched on this a bit. It's, what's the real quality? The real quality here is how does an organization come together in an agile, adaptable, collaborative way. And I think this is kind of a form of organizational fitness. So I think if you look at the qualities of stamina, strength, agility, control, and speed, that's what the Starbucks team have demonstrated, not just in finance function, but sort of across the interdisciplinary community. And I think that's something we all should aspire to. Process change sounds great, but of course it is about changing habits and making change stick. So habits are the critical thing. We've got to keep those habits. So whether you believe it's 3 weeks or 3 months to sustain or to really implant a new habit, you've got to have some key things. You've got to have some kind of action plan. You've got to decide on the behavior you're replacing and the new behavior you're going to have. You've got to have accountability, and you've got to have the self-discipline individually and collectively to bridge between aspiration and accomplishment. And I think this is really, really important, and it's often overlooked, because this is what causes that constant gardener problem, a lack of fixing those new habits. It's great to see what's going on so far, but I think would recommend you all consider that. There are no silver bullets in life, in anything, whether it's in this, in technology, or in medicine. This is the surgeon's note on performance, and I like it because it applies to every aspect of life and business. We hope for these things, for these easy fixes. The reality is making 100 small steps go right collaboratively together, one after the other, everyone pitching in. And I think, again, Starbucks have done a great job, and Jennifer and the team done a great job in demonstrating that. It's about execution, but getting the job done, and not too much time, not too many diversions talking about it. So I'm very, very aware of running slightly over time. We've got your questions here. I can understand if you've got to leave. It will 59 minutes. I'm going to ask one. I think I'll give you one of the questions. I'll point this to Jennifer because what was the hardest part of this undertaking, Jennifer, of all of the things?
I would say that the most challenging was probably understanding the scale and complexity of what we were dealing with. So I would say that without being just digging in, I think being able to look at the scale and complexity and understand what the data meant. So I would say that was probably the biggest challenge, is that looking at what we were dealing with and drilling down into the details, and the numbers were very daunting. But what we did see was when we made a slight change, it created a lot of success. So even though the numbers were daunting and it was very complex, we were able to take it into little pieces And as we changed, say, the definition of one responsibility, it created a wave of resolution. And so that's where that complexity got easier to manage.
Okay, thank you so much. We have taken an hour of your time, everyone. I apologize for taking 10 minutes more than we promised. I hope you found it useful. We'll get back to your questions by email, and we'll circle back with Jennifer and Martin to make sure we've got the collective views on those. Thank you for your time. I hope you found it useful. Have a great rest of your day or rest of the week. And I hope life is getting a bit better for you all. So thank you. Speak soon.
Thank you.